Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Starling, and I am the Director of Military and Veteran Affairs here at the Marines Memorial Club. And it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Meet the Author series featuring David Danelo. David works for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is based out of Philadelphia. He's a 1998 Naval Academy graduate, and he served for 7 years as a Marine infantry officer, including in combat in Iraq. David left the Marine Corps and took up journalism and went on his initial freelance assignment to the Horn of Africa, where he covered Ethiopia and Kenya and Djibouti. And from there, he went to the Gulf Coast of the United States following Hurricane Katrina and reported there. And he's also done some work in collecting observations in Vietnam for a Vietnamese U.S. newspaper. From 2006 to 2007, David worked on a blog that covered operations in Iraq, and his work was published in the Los Angeles Times, in the New York Times, the Marine Corps Gazette, as well as Parade Magazine. David's written 2 books prior to the book we're going to talk about tonight, which is called The Return. His first book was called Blood Stripes, and that is a grunt's view of the war in Iraq. And essentially that narrated the endurance of 5 young enlisted Marines through the deployment they were on in 2004. For that, he got the Military Writers Society of America silver medal in 2006. Consequently, and in my opinion, more important than that, General Mattis put that book on the mandatory reading list for Marines going to Iraq. His second book, The Border, talked about the U.S.-Mexican divide, and David has traveled extensively in Mexico as well as along the U.S.-Mexico border, reporting on that situation. And The Economist endorsed his personable and readable account of the border, and this also earned him a spot on the Customs and Border Protection Commissioner's reading list. So 2 books that he's written have been mandatory reading in 2 organizations. In 2009, the Foreign Policy Research Institute appointed David as a senior fellow, and so he continued to report on Mexico, and in 2011, he went to work for the Department of Homeland Security. And putting his work as a journalist to use there, he helped the government, particularly the U.S. Border Patrol, devise their 4-year strategic plan. And on top of that, he helped the Customs and Border Protection Agency put together their first ever integrated planning guidance, which is a document that is nested with the overall national strategic strategy of the United States. David returned back to the private sector in 2012, and today he writes about international affairs and conducts global research. As I look through his biography, I go right to the verbs of what someone does. And so as I want to summarize David, he writes about international affairs, and in this case, the book, The Return, he writes about his personal experience, which is very relevant to any veteran or active duty service member about to leave or when they leave active service. He consults with border security and management. He investigates geopolitical risks. He conducts global field research, and he advocates and he coaches veterans. You will receive a free copy of his book following this event. And what we'll do is I will relinquish the microphone. David will speak for a few minutes. And the format of this is I will collect question cards, which you should each have with your program for tonight. And some of our assistants will bring those forward. And once he's finished, we'll sort through the questions and have a question-answer period. So probably about 15 minutes, and then the rest of the time to question and answer. So Without any further ado, I welcome David Danelo.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Thanks for braving the weather and the traffic to make it out here. I'd like to talk just a few minutes about, to start off, to think about what a veteran is. And I'll take, if you don't mind, we'll do this school style. And how would you define a veteran? What is a veteran? But I ask that question because we just celebrated Veterans Day. And because we all honored in our society nobly service to country, and particularly military service. The Spanish translation of veterans, by the way, so Delta Airlines, if you end up flying Delta anytime over the next few days, their November issue is dedicated to veterans, so there's all sorts of fun facts in it. And the front, interestingly enough, it's translated into Spanish in the back of it, but the front, all the portions on veterans aren't. They're only written in English, except the editor's part. And a veteran in Spanish is called excombatiente. Very specific. Combat veteran. Which I thought was interesting. And it's an interesting way to frame the identity. But let's take a step back a little bit. Let's think about it as a veteran of our lives, because we're all veterans of something. You are veterans, more than likely, of living in the Bay Area. I am not. Let me tell you, you've got a lot of traffic here. You're veterans of your own personal family. You're veterans of your own life experiences, of the sum total of whatever brings you to this seat right here. There's one very special veteran that's here with me that's a veteran of a long friendship since the second grade. He's a veteran of consulting work, not a veteran of the military. But our own veteran context, James Schaefer, frames a narrative, an experience that James and I have that none of the rest of you share. And I'm highlighting James, not just because he's my friend and I have a chance to single him out, but also because we all have these experiences that we move through in our lives that frame us and that shape us and that we are veterans of, that are unlike anything else that many other people experience. Now let's talk about combat, and let's talk about being a combat veteran. And I'd like to just share a little bit about the book I wrote, The Return, and tell you a little bit about where that evolved for me. Because I've spent about 10 years now as a civilian, and I will still, for the rest of my life, draw upon the experiences that I had, not just as a Marine, not just as part of the Marine culture, but particularly as a Marine in combat in Iraq in 2004. There's nothing else like that life experience that I can directly compare anything else to. And consequently, there's nothing like the departure from that life experience. But, and here's the important thing, civilians go through similar things. In fact, all of you have, I would suspect, when you've done something of great meaning and great purpose that's been probably the most powerful thing that's ever happened to you in your life, that you spent immense amounts of time and energy training and preparing for, and you completed it, and you did it well, and then you don't know what else to do with your life. Olympic athletes, when they leave their sport, often go through this period of deep depression. Buzz Aldrin, after he came back from the moon, poetically called this the melancholy of all things done. I call it exile. It's just a feeling that you don't know where you belong. You're not sure whether you should be there or here or anywhere else. And you knew when you were there, all you wanted to be was back here. But once you got back here, the world didn't make any sense anymore, wherever here is. And for veterans, that's even more powerful because there's no two more opposite experiences in life than war and peace. There's no two greater polarities that we can have as human beings than life and death. And for a veteran, for a combat veteran, for an excombatiente, as the Spanish say, to have that power and meaning, as Chris has here, and I'm going to call him Chris, and I'm going to try to use first names tonight because we're here as civilians. but I would have been calling you sir about 10 years ago. And we would have been having a good time, too. Because I know Chris has the same type of meaning and purpose that he's derived his life from. And many of you sitting here with me as friends have that same life experience, have that same life journey. What I wrote about is how I went through it. And what I wanted to share is that what I learned over the past 10 years is that what we're really asking veterans to do when they come back into civilian life is something that's akin to becoming geniuses. F. Scott Fitzgerald, the great American writer, said that it takes a true genius to hold two opposite thoughts in your mind and still retain the ability to function. And what we're asking veterans to do when they get out is to take that meaning and purpose and power that they found in combat, presuming they found that in combat. And of course, they found tragedy and paradox, as we all do, in combat as well. But take that and move that into something meaningful and powerful in peacetime. And that's hard to do. It's difficult to find whatever it is that you can pull from within you that has as much meaning and purpose, because you have to go back to being an individual. And when you have found so much meaning from the courage that you have poured into the team, to the battalion, to the company, to the platoon, to the regiment that you were a part of. Service before self. Our friend back there with the expansive definition, something else, something for the country. And now you're just being asked to go look out for number one? That's almost a sin. How do you do it? How do you become an individual again? But that's what we're asking veterans to do. And we're asking veterans to do it and to take what they have found in combat, whatever it was, whatever their personal combat experience was, and go and find a dream that's meaningful to them and apply their combat experience towards it. For me, I became a writer. When I was getting mortared in Camp Fallujah in June of 2004, I thought, well, when I get out of this, I think I want to get paid to travel and write for the rest of my life. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that. I read a few books on entrepreneurship, and I failed a lot, as most starting entrepreneurs do, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with watching that here in the Bay Area. But eventually things came together. And how things came together for me, and how things come together every day, is that feeling of facing exile for me never really ends. But I do find that the meaning and purpose that I felt as a warrior, and the sentiment that I drew as a warrior, and the courage that was required as a warrior, I can repurpose and I can apply to being an individual. That's a different type of courage, but it is courage nonetheless. And so that's what I wrote about. That's what the theme of the book is. That's what the context of it is. And that's what my challenge to veterans is not to see themselves as victims, not to be permanently disordered. Because we've used the phrase a lot in our society today, post-traumatic stress disorder. And we speak about it almost stereotypically, as though there's two categories of veterans. You're a hero when you're in uniform, but once you're out, you're damaged goods. I don't believe that. My friends, my comrades, my seniors and my juniors, they can make it. Maybe not all of them, and some of them are going to have longer roads than others, but they can make it. And that's my other purpose for writing that book, this book that I'm humbled to share with you, is I believe in them. I believe in these men and women, and I believe that what they have inside them and the challenges that they've endured, we need in our society. We need in our communities. We need in our companies. And we need in our hearts. Thanks. Look forward to taking your questions.
One of the first questions was about returning as a veteran, returning from combat, transitioning from the military. What was the impact on your closest relationships, that with your family And for many of us, that would include spouses, kids, parents. What was your experience, and what do you see from your research are some of the experiences of our returning veterans?
In my experience, and I would welcome the input of others as well, but generalizing, veterans and civilians have a difficult time having the conversation with each other about not just what combat is like, because oftentimes people want to hear the war stories. They want to know if you killed somebody. They want to know if you are, what it felt like to get wounded. They want to know. There's very specific details that veterans, that warriors aren't comfortable sharing casually. And I think a part of how to reframe the conversation and change the conversation, and I write about this a little bit, is I think veterans need to leave the military with an awareness that peace is what it's all about. And that needs to be a conscious thought and a deliberate thought, that if you are going to take off the uniform and if you are going to pursue a life as a citizen, then you've got to find meaning in peace as a veteran. That has to be something that motivates you, that moves you. And that is a duality, because the military culture, in particular the Marine Corps, is a very stoic culture. And civilian life is Epicurean. The meaning that we derive as civilians is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Marine Corps is not strictly about the pursuit of happiness. On the civilian side, oftentimes, and this is a basic thing, I think geography sometimes affects empathy. I think that civilians, if they want to have a conversation with veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, they need to know where Iraq and Afghanistan are on the map. They need to be able to understand the significance of places like Najaf and Al-Qaim and Talafar and Marja and Wardak and Helmand. Because not knowing what those places mean to soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines is a little bit like not knowing communion if you're a Catholic. Those places have meaning. And I think rather than trying to get into the details of what happened to you or whatever your particular experience is, just take a look at where they came from. Take a look at the map. I think that's a good starting point.
From the perspective of a potential company owner that hires new employees each year, what kind of skills can you expect from combat veterans that might distinguish them from other people applying for jobs? And specifically, we look often to the combat arms. So our soldiers and sailors and Marines that are on the pointy end of the spear that focus on ground combat. What kind of skills do they bring, and is that something that, as an employer, you take into consideration?
And I spent a couple years as a volunteer firefighter after I got out. One of the distinctions between the military culture and the civilian culture is that ultimately the military is, in many ways, and as a firefighter, civilians are paying your salary and they're taking care of you to take care of them. And that's what the American people do for all of us when we're in the Marine Corps, when we're in uniform. When we get out and we're making our own way and we're figuring out how to take care of ourselves, that takes a different type of mindset. And to take who you are as an individual and, as you have done, sir, continue serving as a citizen warrior, that's impressive. And we should all salute that as citizens. And we do. And we rightfully salute law enforcement and firefighting, where many Marines go. But when you're purely a civilian and you're cast away and you have to make that distinction for yourself, that's where you got to look inside yourself and say, who is it that I am?
So some people are very intrusive and they want to know your personal politics, but I'm gonna veer off of that a little bit. But I'll coin it this way: do you see in yourself and in other veterans whom you know, who you've interviewed, any kinds of political shifts or increase in political activity upon returning home? And with the recent backdrop of the elections that we just witnessed, there were a number of former military veteran candidates out there. Not as many as there used to be, but would it be good for us to see a resurgence in that category?
So I'll answer the first general set of questions fairly candidly, since it's a matter of public record. I was appointed as a political appointee for the Obama administration during the first term to run policy and planning for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And I resigned before the end of the first term. I served just a little over a year. I resigned before the election. Soon after, one of the executive orders came down the executive order was in June of 2012. And I resigned at the end of July. And you can draw your own conclusions as to the sentiments and meaning of the resignation, but I'll let that speak for itself. In terms of whether I've seen any veterans increase in political activity, I don't know if I would say more or less, but I think that certainly the rise of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria generates immense emotion. I was in my hat as the director of field researcher for the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I spent about 3 weeks traveling through Iraqi Kurdistan in March of this past year. ISIS had already started to creep through. I was in Mosul, I think the second or third week of March, and I got chewed back onto a bus pretty quick and went off to Erbil and Sulaymaniyah and spent some time there. And it's painful. It's painful to see places that and people that have a connection to not just to the United States, but to American warriors. Being an American Marine in Iraqi Kurdistan is, well, let's just say you can get a free shawarma anywhere you want.
There's a number of questions about post-traumatic stress, and everything from how do you recognize in combat the onset, where do you see the beginnings of post-traumatic stress, how do you recognize it, and is there a propensity to overdiagnose or over-medicate post-traumatic stress? Or is the opposite true? We don't diagnose enough cases early enough. What does your research tell you
So,
there?
Chris, I think you and I can probably have a little bit of a back and forth conversation about this. I think the first thing, you got to know your people. Just like I'm sitting in a room full, I'm sure, of combat leaders who have at some level served or led in combat, and you just got to know your people. And every single warrior is having a different response to many times what are the same things, and everybody has a different point that they're going to snap, and everybody has different things that they're coming back from and coming back to. One of the reasons why I wrote the book is and I'll get to your second question, and then I'm kind of curious as to your thoughts on this from all the warriors you've led as well. I was getting phone calls from Marines that I'd served with, not just in Iraq, but throughout the course of my career, who were going to therapy and counseling and just didn't know what to do because none of the things that therapists and counselors were telling them were effective for them. And we would talk, and I would tell them some observations that I'd made, and I did not find in any consistent theme, either in research or personal experience, that a lifetime of medication is going to be the answer. I think I would use Audie Murphy as a great case study. Audie Murphy was the most decorated soldier in World War II. He came back and got addicted to a sleeping pill called Placidil, and he locked himself in a hotel room for a week because he saw the dangers of that addiction, and he came out clean. That's not to say, and let me take a step back from that, that isn't to say that there isn't a role in medication or that medication doesn't have an important part to play in specific contexts. But that's my own view on it. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so summary, coming back, when a unit has suffered a lot of casualties, and when you have, you're turning around and preparing to go back out again, and the normal transition for units, you lose about a third of your people to transfer. So you've got a third of new joins, new Marines or soldiers, and then you've got your combat veteran base there, training them up, and you have to watch this very carefully. And you have to know your people. I mean, this is what you hit as a particularly as a battalion commander, as a company commander, knowing what those Marines, sailors, soldiers have gone through, and in a specific level of detail as well. A number of people will seek the solution out of a bottle, and it was interesting because the Marine Corps has a zero tolerance policy for drugs, and so if you were to like a certain politician's son, maybe come positive on a drug test, you're gone. But I changed that when I looked at combat veterans, and we owe them, not to because they make one mistake or they're looking for a solution somewhere to cut them loose. So I went through this a number of times where, that is an indicator of a problem that was created in other circumstances, and it's not a lack of discipline necessarily, or just a lack of moral fiber. It is conditions that were set on a battlefield, and as a leader, you need to understand that and have the requisite empathy and help those people stay. The best place for them is with their unit. Their best place is with those other Marines that were there. To me, that's not the only type of therapy, but it is a useful kind of therapy. And I would tell my Marines, if I got a call from somebody I served with in combat, my Marines knew everybody out of the office, and I might be in there for 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And whatever meeting I had wasn't that important as spending time on the phone.
My goal is to change the conversation about what we're having about post-traumatic stress disorder and not call it a disorder, because I think that's the core issue. And the story that I would offer is this. In a Native American tribe just outside of 29 Palms, it was a legend that was passed down to me that I heard when I first got there. And it was this old Native American tribal woman. I was out there just doing some shopping out at Joshua Tree National Park. I thought it was a great story. And I was not a combat veteran at the time. But the story I heard was that apparently, according to legend, the first time that you go on the warpath and you kill in this tribe, you're banished from tribal council for a year. You're banished. You've got to go and commune with nature and figure yourself out and think about some things and just figure out who you are. But when you come back to tribal council after that year, and I never quite figured out what happened if a rival tribe attacked or anything. I figured the rules just got thrown out the window at that point. But when you were brought back into tribal council, you were brought back in and seated at a place of honor. And then you sat at that place of honor, and that you were welcomed back in as somebody whose experience, and this is where I'm drawing from it, whose experience was meaningful to the tribe. To be able to acknowledge and point to the fact that post-traumatic stress is a real thing that real people experience. I couldn't handle fireworks for 2 years. Things going boom were a little bit hairy for me. I swerved under overpasses for, probably about 9-10 months. Just make sure nobody's dropping a grenade from. But when I left, I had an intention to pursue a return. And I make a distinction between transitioning and returning, because I think transitioning is structural. But I think returning is, for lack of a better expression, spiritual. Who's heard the story of Cincinnatus?
At the end of the war, they wanted to crown him emperor. He went back to his farm.
He went back to his farm. You know how long it took him to fight? So he gets summoned, fetches his senatorial toga. This is, the historian Livy wrote about this, and it's a true story. Raises an army, defeats the invaders in 16 days, gets back to his farm. And he had all power. They wanted to make him dictator. Had all the power in the world. To me, that choice took a lot of courage. Have all that power in your hand, to be able to make all the calls. And I like to think that he went back just because he couldn't stand the thought of missing harvest. Because he had as much passion for peace as he did for war. That's what I'm trying to get at. That's what I'm trying to change the conversation to. Is that to be able to have, sir, the sacrifice that you made in 1969, we should honor till time immemorial. And those of us who have experienced combat, we're going to think about it every day for the rest of our lives at some level. But let me tell you, there's one thing that I can do as a civilian that I can't do as a Marine, and that's be my own individual. I couldn't write books as a Marine. I couldn't sit here and talk to you this way, as candidly and as pointedly, and I couldn't talk to Chris like this if I was still in uniform. I'm proud to be a civilian, and I'm proud to be a Marine. And that's the place that the veterans that I see who have gone on to do great things have gotten to. That's the place that the friends of mine and people that I've just read about who have come from my generation, who I see that are changing the conversation about veterans by what they do, not what they say. That's what they've gotten to. And that's, so again, I'm glad that the hands are coming up in the audience because this is where I'd like the conversation to go.
You also hit, your book hits a lot of controversial pieces. In one of the chapters you start out, war is masculine. And you talk specifically about the ongoing debate in opening up ground combat arms to women. But it also begs the question that is there a difference in the experience between male veterans that come back and female veterans that come back? And to take nothing away, we've had a number of females receive combat decorations for heroism. They've led engagement teams in Iraq and in Afghanistan, brought in incredible intelligence, and really been pivotal in what we've done on the ground. I've experienced that personally. But what do you see as, are there any differences, or is it gender neutral here in terms of your experience returning home?
So the particular section Chris is referring to is less a political statement than a spiritual and emotional statement in talking about the duality of war and peace. And I'm not. The way that I approach this is that there is something inherently masculine about how we judge society and how men relate to the experience of pursuing combat and leaving combat in society. And that is not, saying that is not, in my intention, is not to devalue the emotion that women have in the profession of arms, that women experience going through war, and that women endure as veterans. That's not the point at all. The point is to acknowledge that men pursue the military profession in many ways to validate their masculinity. And that's something that's happened for millions of years. In eons of biological evolution, we're pretty socially conditioned as men to defend and protect and fight. And it's built and wired into the way that we have acknowledged our own gender. And I think that's an important thing to state, and the context that I wrote about it, and you can come to your own conclusions when you read the book, is in understanding that duality as a society, and that duality as we welcome veterans back, because male veterans want to be welcomed back as men, that they've done something that has validated their masculinity. And I can't speak to that emotion because I don't have an identity as a female veteran. I can't speak to that validating a sense of femininity. But I can speak to how men feel about it.
Yeah, Nathaniel Fick, who wrote the book One Bullet Away, wrote the introduction to your book, and I thought you did a good job. And one of the things that, as I read the introduction to the book, was that sometimes as a veteran, when people come up and tell you thank you for your service, even though it's happened to me dozens of times, I still don't know what to say in response to that, because I volunteered to be a Marine. And so, do you say you're welcome? Well, it's not really a you're welcome kind of a thing, And what Nathaniel Fick wrote in the intro, and I encourage you to read it. It's a very well-written introduction. He said that, in a way, I didn't do it for you, I did it for me. And I guess inside, a lot of veterans feel that way, that we signed up for something. We volunteered to go and do the nation's work at the pointy end of democracy. And I would like to know maybe your opinions of how you have handled it. The other thing is, when I'm in an airport and they allow military to board the airplane first, I would never do that in the sense that, when I'm in the airport, I don't have a certain privilege because I'm a Marine, as opposed to maybe when you're somewhere else.
In terms of being thanked for my service, I think it's definitely better than the alternative. And I'll actually tell a quick story about the alternative. I was doing an interview in Sarajevo with a lawyer who was about 75, 80 years old, and he was this irascible professor, and I forgot his name at this point, but he had very, very strong views on the U.S. military in general, and he was calling me a war criminal. And it was really interesting because it was like, really? Okay. And we were having and he was like, no, you were a war criminal when you were in uniform because Bush was a war criminal. He sent everybody to Iraq and you were part of it. And it was like, wow, all right, okay. And just because of the nature of the debate, or the nature of the conversation, I realized that this guy, I wasn't going to get anywhere in the interview until I fought with him, because he just wanted to fight with me. So I pushed back, and I defended my own honor, and we went back and forth a little bit, and that was basically what he was looking for. And that experience doesn't happen at this point in society, because, at least not in American society, because we're all universally thanked for our service. There's three things that I think have to be responded to thank you for your service. First, thanks for making that distinction. Thanks for making the distinction between whatever the political views are and the fact that I made a choice to volunteer to serve. I appreciate that. Second, I usually try to watch to see if the person is doing it basically as a defense mechanism or to kiss my ass. Because I've seen, there's a lot of that. That's where I'm going to thank you for your service. Now, let's not talk about the military anymore. Because I've done my job, I thank you for your service, so I don't want to know anymore. And I have a problem with that, because I think I think, again, that diminishes the importance of the conversation. Every citizen can go and pull the lever at election time, and that is what drives the entire continuum of events that puts me wherever it is that I am, or puts any of us wherever we are. And if you can't take the time as a citizen to recognize that I'm not going over there for me, I'm going over for you, sir, ma'am. I work for you. It's your vote that takes me wherever it is that I go. I think that that's an important part of the conversation. And sometimes, so to answer your question of how do I respond to being thanked for my service, I try not to end the conversation there. I have as much of a responsibility as a veteran to bridge the civil-military divide as civilians do. And if I can't, maybe I don't have a conversation about my service, but I can have a conversation about what it means to serve. I can have a conversation about Iraq and Afghanistan on the map. I can have some form of conversation or discussion about it. I can't say the hell with them. That's just where I come from. The best comparison that I can bring is not so much previous eras of American veterans. The best research I've read is on Israeli combat veterans. So, And there's a huge distinction in Israel because Israel is so small, and let's set aside any political feelings anyone has about Israel one way or another right now. But because Israel is so small, when the country goes to war, the whole country goes to war, and everybody in the country has both a military and a civilian identity. And so when you come back from the military, you just really don't talk, like everybody wants to get back to peace. And so there's not a sense of needing to explain yourself or to justify yourself. The Swiss have this societal relationship to war by virtue of their size and proximity. There's 2 points that I would make about America's relationship to combat and war. One of which is the veterans population is actually a little bit larger than we think it is. Less than 0.5% are serving at any point in time, but do you know how many veterans there are in the United States who have the title veteran by virtue of as a military or civilian? Anybody know? 21 million. 21 million, which is larger than I thought it is. It's about 7% of the population. So that's a larger sample size to draw from. But at the same time, everybody has a different experience of being a veteran. Some are combat veterans, some are not. I'm a 1-2 combat veteran, which in a room full of Marines of the past 10 years, many of whom I'm good friends with, who are 4 or 5-2 combat veterans. I mean, I'm a 1-2 combat veteran. Yeah, Dave's been writing. He's been having some fun.
Another question that we get a lot of is did the military do a good enough job preparing you to return? And you leaving the Marine Corps as a captain is different than a first-term Marine or leaving as a Lance Corporal or as a specialist in the Army. Are the programs that are there now, are they good enough to make that transition to help them find a civilian identity?
There's a PS to the story I was telling, so I'm going to comment on that and then loop back. There are about 40,000 organizations in the United States that are dedicated to helping veterans. 40,000. So I don't think that we need another organization. I don't think we need another program. And if you're going to ask me my opinion as to whether the programs are sufficient, I think when we try to speak and everybody wants to speak in programmatic terms in helping veterans. Everybody does. And it's, but if you want to help a veteran, hire one or talk to one or have a conversation with one or enable them to bridge that civil-military divide, enable them to return. And to your point, you may not be able as a veteran to talk about your service. There's plenty of things I'm not perfectly comfortable talking about. But I'm very comfortable with my civilian identity. And that's where it is that you're trying to get people to. I don't know if a goal is necessarily to get people to talk. I think the goal is to get veterans comfortable being civilians. And the terms often used, productive members of society.
You have, I don't know how many chapters, but it's like a dozen or 20 chapters within your book where you talk about things. If you were to zero in on one that is the most important piece for a veteran or for someone who is going to hire a veteran to pull out of your book and look at, what part of that would it be in your book?
We've touched on it already, but there's a chapter called Post-Traumatic Stress Asset. And it's a pretty straightforward, look, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer. Drug companies may dispute my conclusions, and I'm not here representing the VA or anything, but the bottom line is that I believe the majority of combat veterans, maybe not every single one, and maybe not every single circumstance, but the majority can take whatever stress that it is that they've experienced and use it in a meaningful and true and purposeful way in a civilian life. And that's...
Well, we are reached our time, but I've volunteered you to stand over there and drink wine and
happy
talk
to.
informally.
I'm happy to. Thank you for coming
and,
out.
And I appreciate it. We got a call from David from Detroit a few hours ago, and for a while we were trying to find somebody who looks like him to come up here and play him. But we're glad you make it, and we hope that you return back to the Marines Memorial Club in the future.
Thanks a lot.